Hey everyone, welcome to the Return of the Logos podcast, where we're attempting to return logic to a chaotic world by shining a light on the shadows.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Return of the Logos podcast. We want to thank everybody for all your support, all your downloads, all your views, all your shares. Please keep doing it. Engage with us on social media. Do it. You know all the story. We've been over it.
Go, you know the thing.
You know what to do.
You know what to do. Get on the internet and say stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Andy, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing good.
Good.
Doing good. It's been a long week. I'm happy to be here and relax and have some good conversation.
And that is what we're doing today. This is going to be a little more conversational, an interesting topic that I brought up to Andy, and we both thought it would be interesting to talk about. But before we get into that, we do have a little bit of housekeeping. I've got one and Andy's got one. So I'll start. And this is back referencing, it would have been episode 9, the episode The Land of Criminals, referencing something that I had said about Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
This is the solo
This was the
episode.
this was the solo episode, and I made a mistake. It was more just of a misspeak, but I want to clear it up, try to retain our integrity here. I had misspoke when I was talking about the administrative error. There was an order of deportation, and then there was a stay on that order of deportation. So when I was speaking to this, I had said that the administrative error was that he couldn't be deported to Guatemala, and I misspoke. The reason that he had a stay of deportation was because he was in fear for his life from this Guatemalan gang, but the stay of deportation was that he couldn't be sent back to El Salvador because that Guatemalan gang operated in El Salvador. His and his family's life were threatened by that gang. So that's the mistake that I made. And obviously, Bukele has cleaned up El Salvador. It's very safe there now, so there's not really an issue for him or his family to be afraid of that Guatemalan gang operating in El Salvador.
So the whole reason for the stay was because he was in fear. He was in a gang, and he was He was in fear that if he was put in prison, that he would get offed or his family.
Partially, yeah. Because he was in a rival gang,
Right.
he was in fear for his life, and also his family's lives were threatened.
Because he was in a gang.
Because he was in a gang.
Yeah, so that's what gave him the stay. And that gang no longer exists.
At least not in El Salvador, and at least not to the extent
Right.
that where it's a safety factor.
Either way, so we bring him back, and then what?
Right.
We
It's
just deport him somewhere else?
Well, and the interesting point was, it's like everybody's like, well, give him his due process. Okay, put him in front of a computer, open up Zoom, have a Zoom call with a judge. Hell, I've done some work recently in court buildings, and a lot of courts are doing stuff over Zoom now. Have a Zoom call and just have a judge say, yeah, El Salvador's safe for you now. Done, goodbye. And then it's over.
Yeah.
That's his due process.
Yeah. Well, he had plenty of due process.
He did.
They jumped on a clerical, basically it's a clerical error
Yes.
that they jumped on.
They jumped on a clerical error.
and now they're doubling and tripling down.
Yeah. Well, I would say the air around this is kind of thinning out. It's not quite so thick anymore. I think they jumped on it so quick, they didn't actually look into the background of the
so
guy.
Once the facts came out that he was abusing his wife and that he was a gang member and all of the extenuating circumstances.
Right.
Once actually the facts came out, it kind of sort of took the air out of the room.
Yeah, they're slowly and quietly backing away from it. So
Yeah. Very slowly.
very slowly, but they are. So I'm sure they'll find another.
Oh, they're going to,
They'll find another Maryland man.
They'll find another poster boy.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So that was my housekeeping. And Andy, you had one for the last episode.
Yeah. So, couple things. One is I need to fact check myself. You mentioned monoclonal antibodies. And in my mind, that was not something that I felt available to the public, before the vaccines, but that wasn't true. They were out before the vaccines. So when we were naming off therapeutics and you said monoclonal antibodies, you were actually correct. So I wanted to correct myself. All of this stuff was limited, and that brings me to my second point of housekeeping. So I was trying to complete a circle, and we sort of went off on a different track of conversation, and I never got back to it, so I never really made the point. But when I was talking about all the therapeutics, why they, air quotes, weren't allowed to work, and why they were taken from the public, basically, or taken from doctors as an option to treat the public, I never really completed that circle. So I've had COVID 3 times. All of them after I was vaccinated, by the way.
I've had it twice, I know for sure, possibly a third time also, but yeah.
Yeah, so.
Along you and everybody else,
yeah,
right?
Super cool.
You, me, and everybody else.
Super cool. I'm glad I did it. That's so much better. I'm sure they would say, well, you'd be dead if you wouldn't have.
Sure, yeah. Well,
it's real easy to say what would have happened.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because there's no...
Because there's
no counter.
Yeah.
What do they call it? Not a counterfactual, but I don't know.
What is that term? Yeah.
You can't prove a dispositive or something like that.
Yeah. So I have a member of my family that is an RN, and when we got it, we just talked to her as far as like, what do we do?
That's probably a smart move.
And so she gave us a bunch of stuff to do, and I'm not going to mention names because, like I said, this became political. But she admitted that, yeah, they had stuff that was working. Those therapeutics that we mentioned, they were working. And the government basically shut them down and said, you can't prescribe these anymore. You can't use them anymore. And it was based off of some study. They looked at one study that was, I don't want to say inaccurate, but it was incomplete. It was not an effective study. It was not something they should have followed. Oh, they don't work.
Right.
But the thing is none of those things are dangerous. Those medications are prescribed to people.
All the time.
All around the world, all the time. They have a tremendous safety track record.
Yeah.
There's nothing dangerous about trying them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're not going to get any worse from taking ivermectin.
Yeah. So none of that made any sense to me at the time. I talked to her and she said, yeah, it was really weird. Like we were kind of figuring stuff out, and that's the circle I'm trying to finish. Because I said they threw the kitchen sink at it. That's what they were doing. But the whole time they were doing it, anytime that they started to find combinations of things that worked or things that were effective, the government would stop them. It would literally stop them. It would come down from medical authorities, bureaucrats, down to hospital administrators, and then hospital administrators would then make the decision for everybody.
Right. They don't want anything coming down on them.
Right. So you got a bunch of people around a boardroom table, and they've got the government telling them not only is it not effective, but it's not safe. And you're opening yourself up to
lawsuits. Yeah.
So you got the government basically threatening them, saying, if you go against us and you use these therapeutics that doctors are already using and finding to be effective in maybe not every case, but in a high amount of cases, they're basically like threatening these administrators. Well, you and I both know what people around a boardroom table are going to decide.
Yeah.
They don't give a shit about patients.
They care about keeping the hospital open.
Yeah, they're running a business.
Yeah.
They're running a business.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my whole point of, because I said they threw the kitchen sink at them, but I never really came back around to, but they weren't allowed.
Right.
They were literally shut down.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit about the fact that you can't have an emergency use authorization for a vaccine if there are effective therapeutics.
Right.
If there's effective treatments.
Right. Which begs the question, why did the government want to solely use that vaccine? Right.
That's what we were sort of leading to.
That's what we were.
So my cleanup is that we never completed that circle. We just asked the question.
Yeah.
The answer is those medications that were being used and effective in a decent percentage of people, Pharmaceutical companies don't make money.
They
off
don't
of
make
those.
money on those yet.
They've been around for too long.
And there could be all kinds of motivations, but to me, that's all you got to say right there. Information has come out. There's no doubt COVID was the largest transfer of wealth in human history, and that was part of it.
Yeah.
That was part of it for sure. All the money going to the drug companies.
Yeah, and not just the drug companies. Every mom and pop had to close down. Meanwhile, Amazon became a part of everyone's life. Everyone in America, Amazon became a part of their life. And now they're a staple, a mainstay.
Yeah, it was pretty nefarious. All right, so now that we've got the housekeeping out of the way, I had brought this topic up to Andy. We both agreed it sounded like an interesting conversation to have. We're going to talk about principles versus morals. What's the difference between the two? Is one a derivation of the other? How does that play out interpersonally, socially, legally? So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. You know, you may be thinking to yourself, well, that sounds stupid. I don't care about that. Or, I never considered that. Never thought about that. I think either way, this discussion is actually something that needs to be had at this moment in time right now. I know we both have thought about it a little bit, but I intentionally didn't think about it too deeply because I wanted Andy and I to maybe flesh this out a little bit live during the recording. So
this is going to be a conversational episode.
Yeah.
There's not going to be a lot of clips, anything like that.
We may touch on some current issues as maybe they relate to principle versus morality. But it's just, it's just going to be a conversation about what this means.
This is what this show is about. We're interested in getting to the truth.
Exactly.
And the way that you find truth is if you get to the root of the matter. Principles and morals are where majority of societal norms, traditions, and taboos, that's where that stuff comes from. That's the roots of it. So where are our origins,
Yeah, it gives you an understanding of where you're at culturally. The problem that I see current day is that, one, people aren't really thinking about principle and or morality, and they're not considering the society that they've grown up in and how that society was formed and what morals or principles was that society based on.
Yeah, and consider in this day and age, we live in a world where we've got an entire generation of people talking about my truth, living my truth.
I hate that so
and
much.
My true self.
I hate that so
and,
much.
And so, what is that based on?
Yeah.
What is that?
Right. I don't have an answer.
Like, there's really no such thing.
No, there's...
Like, if you said my opinion,
right,
the way I feel.
Well, I think that that's an outgrowth of this idea of individualism, which I would say that leftists, they can't win that argument as far as individual liberty, individuality, individual freedom. So as they normally do, instead of actually trying to assess an issue and adjust, they play with the language.
They just twist it.
They twist the language until it conforms to what they want it to conform to, which I think that's where this whole my truth thing came from. I mean, collectivism, you can't defend collectivism against individualism. You just can't. But yeah, that whole my truth thing.
There would have to be a complete thought in order for them to do that. And they don't have it.
Yeah.
They just look at individual things and they're like, how do I feel about this?
Right.
That's my truth.
Well,
okay, how do I feel about that? There's no consistency, like you've said probably 100 times now.
Right. Well, and that's the thing too, is that, people who are more liberal, they tend to act more on their feelings and emotions as opposed to, I hate to use the term logic, but I mean, because it makes it sound like they're idiots. Some of them are, but they tend to act on their emotions and their feelings more than reason and facts and logic. That was kind of a good intro. Where we should start is with some definitions. We'll get the definitions and then see if Andy and I agree on definitions.
And see if we can flesh it out.
And see if we can flesh it out. I have the definitions of principle and moral, and these are both from the New Oxford Dictionary. Principle is a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief, behavior, or chain of reasoning. Okay, that's principle. Moral is concerned with the principles of right and wrong behavior and the goodness or badness of human character.
It's worded so weird.
It's worded weird.
I don't even like the way it's worded.
The goodness or badness.
Yeah.
It's weird, yeah. But I think
it's like they're intentionally not trying to say what they're saying.
Kind of, yeah. Because I think that they don't necessarily even have a good definition themselves, right?
Yeah.
But the interesting thing that I noticed was in the definition of moral, they use the term principles, concerned with the principles of right and wrong. And the definition of principle is a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as a foundation. We want to try to flesh this out, the difference between these two things, because there is a difference. In my mind, principle is black and white. It applies less to humanity and to the human condition than morality. A principle is more of a observable fact, not necessarily taking into consideration the flaws of human beings. That's just kind of my take on what principle is.
I think it is considered to be a universal truth, but it can be used in different ways. So sometimes you'll make a decision about something, not the most convenient decision or maybe not even the best decision. You justify it by saying it's the principle of the matter. Right?
Okay, yeah.
So that's one way that it can be used. And then there are basic principles, sort of a factual universal truth, like the principle of gravity or the law of gravity. That's a principle. That's a universal truth, right?
Right.
And then there are principles that are based in morality. So morality is almost like a subset of principles. Like you can have principles without morality, but I don't think you can have morality without principles, if that makes any sense.
That's kind of the way I view it as well. Like you said, a principle is operating from a fundamental truth. So if we look at something that we as a society agree on as a right or a wrong, right? Say, don't kick babies in the face. That's a principle.
Yeah.
Right? That's just wrong. Well, but how do you explain why it's wrong? How do you do that with a principle? I can do it with a moral. I can do it from a moral point of view. I mean, I guess you can make a utilitarian argument is like, well, you're destroying a member of your society, so your society in the future will have less people contributing to it, thus degrading functionality of your society.
Or potential
of your society.
That's all excuses, though. The thing is like I hear those arguments from whenever you hear a theologian debate an atheist, it always comes out. How do you know what right and wrong is? So we live in a society that wants to be principled, air quotes, but they want to remove themselves from all morality. They don't want it to have anything to do with morality.
Right, because they can't answer the question where morality comes from. Whereas people who are religious have an answer for that, right?
Yeah.
But a secular atheist doesn't have that answer as to where it comes
No, because
from.
they have to define themselves as a good person based off of anything but a connection with a greater force.
Right. And well, to kind of just jump into then my idea about morality, I believe that God has imprinted that on us. It's a function of our soul. That's kind of where I come down on it. I mean, whether it's part of your soul or something else from God that he's given us, I don't know. But to me, that's the logical impression that I get, is that it's something that God has given us impressed upon our soul. And I think you can make the case for that because you don't see morality in animals.
No.
From a Christian or religious perspective, what is the one thing that we have that animals don't? Is a soul. And so to me, that's where I think the morality comes from. It's not sufficient, and that's why God gave us the commandments. Because even though we have that morality imprinted on us, we're flawed, we do bad things for self-gratification or out of anger or for whatever reason, because we're human, we can justify it. We can justify the bad things that we do, maybe based on a false principle or even a correct principle we have in our mind that we can twist to suit our narrative. So this is why, even though it's the morality is imprinted in our souls, God has given us the commandments as a backstop is the wrong word, but as a bulwark, right?
Sure. Yeah.
To say, yeah, all those things that you think are wrong, yeah, I'm telling you right here that it's wrong. Right?
Yeah. So I don't know that I have a completely different opinion than you, but I think I might come at it from a little different angle. I think you can accept that because you do have a belief in God. I think there are hundreds of thousands, millions of people that are going around and they're practicing God's morals. They can't admit it. They can't accept it. It's something that's been imprinted on them. So I get what you're saying, like it's imprinted on our souls. But I think there are a lot of people that society and years and generations of these sort of universal truths, right, that are based in morality, that are based in biblical teachings that come from God. There are a lot of people out there that are practicing things that are moral, but it's learned behavior. It's just from society.
Reinforced through culture.
Yeah, it's culture and it's society, because, depending on where you go in the world, the moral values
drastically different.
Are very, very different, right? So we got a bunch of blue-haired atheists running around in America, and they know the difference between right and wrong. They just don't want to admit that they know where it comes from.
Right.
They can't accept that it comes from a divine source because that whole egotism, there is no God, I am my own God, my truth.
Well, and I think too, something that I always hear that drives me insane is also this kind of liberal or leftist argument that all cultures are equal. No, they're not.
It's one of the biggest mistakes the left makes.
It's huge.
Yep.
I mean, I'm going to take an ancient culture, for example, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't apply to cultures now, but this is just an easy example. So you had the Aztec culture practiced human sacrifice and even infant sacrifice. So you're going to tell me that a culture that was based on that type of morality, that culture is equal to the culture that we have in the United States? I don't think so.
Yeah.
Well, they may agree because they kill babies anyway, but not to get off topic.
Yeah. This is not the topic, so I'm going off on a rant here. This is one of the biggest mistakes that the left makes. Their assumption that all cultures are equal and equally valuable. See, they don't use terms like good and evil.
No.
They can't bring themselves to do that because that implies that they're might be some sort of moral code.
Yeah, because
right?
also they've bought into the idea of relativism, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you can't do that.
So they can't. That challenges their entire thought structure, right? Mm-hmm. And it challenges their entire worldview, really. Mm-hmm. So this whole like diversity is our strength. That's what makes businesses stronger. It's what makes companies stronger. That is based on a fundamental falsehood that all cultures are created equal, that they're all the same.
Yeah.
And that they have the same, everybody universally, they want the same things.
Right.
It's not true.
No, it's not.
It's not. I mean, I don't know how anyone in America can relate with, I mean, unless you're a sociopath or a pedophile, I don't know how you can relate with something as evil as bringing a child into the world, your own flesh and blood, raising them, and then strapping a bomb to them and sending them into a market. This is not a moral culture. America is a moral culture. We are not the same.
We're not the same. But that goes back to the idea that morality is something imprinted or given to us by God. Just so happens that fundamentally,
America has the one true God.
no.
Sorry,
That's kind of what I was going to say, but not really. No, because this is an interesting point. Because fundamentally, the God of Muslims is technically the same God as Christians, and technically the same God as Jews.
the God
right?
of Abraham.
The God of Abraham.
Yes.
This is where you see that culture has a big part to play in morality. You have these three societies that break off from each other. I don't necessarily want to go too deep into this, and I'm not the most well-versed in Islam, but I'm pretty sure that even in Islam, murder is wrong. However, they carve out an exception, and the exception being the infidel or the non-believer
Yeah.
are the exception.
Yes.
It goes back to this weird thing where it may be given to us by God, but we're still kind of at the whims of our own humanity. I don't know, maybe that throws my whole premise off.
That's what I was getting at. So I wasn't trying to poke holes in what you were saying, but what I'm saying is it's not imprinted on everybody's soul. It is something that is derived from God, and we found that the one true God proves to be moral.
Okay, I see where you're going. Right.
So
okay.
I understand what you're saying, that Muslims technically have the God of Abraham and they just had the Prophet Muhammad. Let me point out one thing about that, and then we'll move on, because I wasn't planning on getting into this topic, but there's a difference between someone being Muslim and Islamic.
Yes.
Okay, so Islam is not only a religion, it's also a state. It's a form of government, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's where you get the jihad from.
Right.
And the morals that those folks have, they are not equal.
Yeah. Where we ended on that was a good spot. We understand each other, and I think we agree. Morality does come from our Creator. It comes from God. And how you know that you are serving the one true God is through the morality that is practiced. It's regard for human life.
Pretty fundamental.
So human life is a fundamental moral because we're created in God's image.
Yes.
And so anyone who disregards the humanity or the value of human life.
Value is a perfect word. I'll take it in a different direction. There are a lot of cultures that are honor cultures, where when you dishonor your family, the things that your own parents will do to you, your value is diminished. As a human, you lose your value. There are a ton of honor cultures out there. I don't think that's a moral stance. It could be as simple as someone is born with a disability.
I don't think that honor in any way has anything to do with morality, because honor is an outgrowth of your own ego.
My point is this: if you dishonor your family and they lock you in the basement, they disregard you, or worse, throw you away like trash, that's not a moral stance. And there are plenty of cultures, honor societies, where if you dishonor your family, whatever the hell that means in that culture, your value as a human
is less.
As a child of God.
An honor culture is not an inherently morally superior culture because, while not something that's completely horrendous, I mean, there's something to be said to have honor. But the idea of an honor culture all stems from ego. And an ego is part of a human psyche. It's not given by God. But I think we've kind of arrived at the same spot on morality.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think it's as simple as everybody thinks.
No, I think it's incredibly complicated.
Like when you start digging down on it, admittedly, I'm biased, but
sure,
I know where morals come from because I serve the one true God.
Yeah.
This
is why I think that secular people disregard that. Someone who is a believer has an easy answer to where my morals come from, whereas they don't, and they can't comprehend how you can have such an easy answer to it.
Honestly, normally, I intentionally don't make statements like, I know what morals are because I serve the one true God.
Right. I don't typically either.
I'm just telling the truth. That's how I know. That's my compass, right? Mm-hmm. What do these people have as a compass? And so normally when I speak with these people in mind, people that are rudderless with no compass. Because if I can get through to them, if I can say something that rings true, if I can plant a seed,
then they're more open to that later.
Then they're more open to that as they go through life and as they experience hardship, struggle, anything where God is needed. Mm-hmm. Maybe their heart might be a little bit more open to it. Whereas if you just come out and say that, they're just like, oh, some wacky Bible banger. Let me just go back to whatever excuses I've made up in my own head my whole life.
No, I think that's
for why I make moral decisions, but I have no idea where they come from, and they can't come from God, and all of these like conflicting concepts,
Well, and I think that's a valid reason if you're having that discussion with someone just out of the gate, say, oh, it's just from God. Because it softens them to the possibility of it later down the line if you can reach them on a different level.
Well, and if they see something in you, and that's part of being a witness, is meeting people where they're at. Look, I'm not going on mission trips. I'm not some godly man. I'm fallen. I'm no one to preach or teach. But I do know that if they see something in you, if they see light, when they do hit that roadblock, when they do hit that struggle, when they do stumble and fall, they're going to be much more likely to be like, I don't know what that guy has, but that's what I want. Mm-hmm. And then if they come to you with that, you're like, oh, it's real easy. Mm-hmm. I don't have anything. The living God who lives in me, he's got everything you need. So, and they'll be more open to that. I'm not a fire and brimstone guy. I'm a love, because I think I'm a little of both. You might be a little bit more fire and brimstone than me. Yeah.
I mean, I think that, that gets into a whole discussion about the different denominations, which is not...
That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, we're not talking about it. But
wait, what are we talking about?
Wait, what are we...
Morals? Morals?
All right, so we'll pull it back from that a little bit. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was the idea of principles and morals and the differences between the two and how this plays out in society and culture. One of the things that I was thinking about, how principles and morals present themselves in the law. Does the law come from one or the other, or does it come from a combination of both? Actually, I want to throw that question to you and see what you think about that.
Yeah, well, there's so many ways to come at that. When you say law, first thing that comes into my mind is there's a ton of people out there that don't want to admit it, but our laws are based on Judeo-Christian values. Okay, so everybody out there that wants to bitch and moan and cry about separation of church and state, whatever their hang-up is, right? I don't want you to enforce your religion upon me by law. Well, okay, then I guess you're allowed to kill people. I guess you're allowed to rob people. I guess you're allowed to rape, steal, plunder. You're saying that there cannot be law based in morality because it comes from the Bible. So that whole argument to me is so off base, and it's so out of touch with the reality that is the United States.
It's funny because basically your first intro into that question goes to actually my conclusion of the question.
Okay.
And
Just kind of jumped ahead of you there.
Well, no, we can discuss it. But my conclusion to the question is that law is actually based on morality. It's based on what you ought and ought not do.
Yes.
Not based on a principled position. And you hear liberals and leftists say this a lot, that you can't legislate morality. The first time I heard it, I didn't really think about it, but at first listen, it kind of rings true because you're like, well, yeah, people are free to do what they want. So it kind of hits you as true, but the more you think about it, it's not right. All laws, at least the fundamental laws, so take, for example, like the Bill of Rights. That is a moral position. Those are moral positions. The fact that you have the right to say what you think and what you believe without fear of reprisal, that's a moral position. The Second Amendment exists because you have a right to protect yourself and defend yourself.
That's the spirit of the law.
That's the spirit of the law.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Particularly to defend yourself from the government. That's the spirit of the law. And that's a moral position. This person has no right to aggress against me physically. So I have the right to defend myself.
Yeah, and you have every right to defend yourself and your family.
And your family.
Yep.
And anyone else who's in danger for that matter.
Yep.
So then why is that a moral position as opposed to a principle position? I can't think of a principle that says you have a right, a fundamental right to be alive. I can't think of a principle that can support that, but I can think of a morality.
Well, you can think of a principle, but it's going to be founded in morality.
Right.
Like I said at the beginning.
When you dissect the principle.
You can have principles without morality, but you can't have morality without principles. So there's overlap.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Like I said, from my perspective of morality coming from God is that because I am made in the image of God, my life has meaning, and everyone's life has meaning. Everyone's life is precious to God.
You're talking about intrinsic value that comes from the fact that you are precious. Every life is precious.
Right.
To God.
Right.
To the Creator.
He is the only one that gets the decision as to how, when, where, and why your life ends. We won't get into a whole thing about fate and does God really intervene in the actions of man. We don't need to get into all that. But the morality is the backbone of the law. If you look at the definition of moral, the principles of right and wrong behavior and the goodness or badness of human character. Now, it doesn't say the good or the bad of human character, the goodness and the badness. Now, the way I interpret that is there are levels of goodness. There are levels of badness. Some things are worse than others. They may all be in this bag that we call bad, right?
Right.
But in that bag, there are certain sections that are, this is worse than that. This is not quite as bad as that. And this is why the law recognizes the different degrees of murder. First degree murder, second degree murder, manslaughter.
Intentional.
Right. Because we understand.
Premeditated.
Right. Because we understand that not everything is black and white. Killing somebody who invades my home is not the same as a contract killer getting $1 million and then go out and plotting to kill a guy and then take his life. Right? That's a completely different scenario.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
This is where I see the line as law coming from morality. And another example of that is like, to go back to the free speech thing, I heard an interesting point made by Tim Pool. And as I think about it, I agree with it, is that we never actually had true free speech. In the 1970s, George Carlin was arrested for profanity because he said wordy dirds.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've had profanity laws up until the 70s or 80s. There were blasphemy laws, just coming off the top. There were blasphemy laws, you know, in the early 1700s and 1800s, right? If you blasphemed, you would be punished, right? So that's not free speech. Why were blasphemy laws enforced? Why were obscenity laws enforced? Well, it can't be on the principle of freedom of speech, because if you operate at the fundamental principle of free speech,
that means anything goes.
That means anything goes.
Yeah.
But we didn't enforce it that way, right? We enforced it on a moral level because as a society in the 1800s, we viewed blasphemy as something that is horrible.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And then as society liberalizes, that erodes away. What you think about that?
Yeah, so all you liberals that are real upset about the separation of church and state and you can't legislate my morality and all that kind of stuff, it's like a it's like a feminist that wants the guy to pay.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, I like this, and I like this.
Yeah, you can't pick and choose.
And we should be equally represented in the workforce. Well, there's 99% of bricklayers are men.
Yeah.
We got to get some women in there laying bricks. Oh, no. No, I just mean in the C-suite.
Yeah.
I just mean the really high-paying, powerful jobs. Those are the only ones that I'm talking about.
Well, that's an interesting point because are they operating from a moral premise or from a principle premise?
I would say neither.
I would say neither.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to get into that later. There's a question I want to get into
they may
later.
have a principled stance that they derive their belief system from, but
it's not technically principled because
it's not a universal truth.
It's not a universal truth.
Yeah.
So, and that's something that I wanted to maybe get into a little bit later.
So I'm basically saying, just like feminists want to pick and choose where they need to be exactly like men or better in order for it to be fair. So they pick and choose that stuff. So do the atheists and the leftists that claim that there is no justification for Judeo-Christian morals have anything to do with our government. Separation of church and state. Okay, well, if that's the case, then I don't want to hear you ever say that you're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.
That's not real, right? A right to an education, a right to free health care, a right to tattoo my face and still get a job, and a right to everything's a frickin' right for them.
Well,
you know?
and I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but I do want to say is that the whole discussion about what your rights are, where most people make that argument from is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Constitution and Bill of Rights are.
And it makes sense because they have no fundamental understanding of where moral values come from, or where moral principles come from, to state it more appropriately for this show.
Right. And as a quick point, and we'll move on, the Constitution and Bill of Rights, people have it backwards. The Constitution is actually our rules for the government.
What they can and can't do.
This is what you're not allowed to do this to me. That's what the Constitution and Bill of Rights are. It is not a document saying you, citizen, can do this. Granted, if the government can't stop you from doing it, technically you can. But then that gets into a whole other question of what you can do versus what you should do. And then that gets us to morality.
You're talking about the spirit of the law. Well, I don't think there's anything more apparent than the founders saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Basically, you have to be an idiot not to recognize this.
Yes.
They're self-evident. Without us saying this, they exist and everybody knows it.
Well, but the interesting thing is that they go on to say it because they know that tyranny erupts.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's like, we think everybody knows this, but we're going to say it just so there's no confusion.
We hold it to be self-evident. Everyone is endowed by their creator with these rights.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So all of these leftists and atheists and secularists who say, you can't take this constitutional right from me, or you're trampling on the Constitution. It's like,
it's a constitutional crisis.
It's a constitutional crisis.
Sorry.
Well, then if you don't believe in God and that we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, then you can't believe in the Constitution.
Yeah, if you think that's what's evil and tyrannical and terrible about America, is a bunch of old white Christians.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. America is an experiment. People don't recognize. It's an experiment, and it is one of the most successful experiments that the world's ever seen.
For sure.
And now we've got a bunch of do-nothing people. They're like, I'm not going to pay my student loans back. Screw that.
Right. It's the same expression as the trope of the spoiled rich kid. You have a great life, you're handed everything you want, and you turn into an asshole.
Yeah, because you've never seen struggle.
Because you've never seen. Yeah. You live in the greatest country that's ever been, the freest country that's ever been, and you've got all of this at your disposal, and all you do is complain about it. You're an asshole.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
It's the same thing.
You look like an asshole, you dress like an asshole, and somehow in this great country, you're still elevated out of your fucking parents' basement. It's like, what are you all pissed off about? Okay, so I'm going to say one more thing and then I'll let it go. All these people, they know what right and wrong is. They just can't admit where it comes from.
Yeah, I'm on board with you on that.
They know what right and wrong is. Someone walks into a job interview and their face covered with tattoos and they got piercings in every possible place you can put them, and they don't get a job. They know exactly why they didn't get the job.
Yeah.
Don't act like you don't know.
They want to be the oppressed, so they have something to bitch and complain about.
It's intentional.
Yeah.
It's intentional.
I think you've got me with that.
Yeah.
That kind of leads me into, well, what is justice? And this is from the American Heritage Dictionary. Justice is fairness, the principle of moral rightness, decency. So, again, it's kind of a mealy-mouthed definition. It mentions fairness, and it says the word principle, but it says the principle of moral rightness. Well, we talked about a principle as being kind of like a black and white thing. The principle of moral rightness. So there's a principle, black or white, that morality
defines as correct or incorrect. Which could also be translated as good and bad.
Good and bad, yeah. There's a lot of talk these days about justice and injustice, and to just kind of tie it back to what we were talking about, well, the idea of social justice. It seems like these days everybody has their own idea of what justice is.
Well, every lie or good lie is rooted in a small truth.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, but the source of everything that these folks are using, the source is all morality. They've just unmoored themselves or removed themselves from that version of morality. But that's where it all comes from. That's where they get it from. So this outrage against injustice, I sympathize with it. Honestly, I can't stand injustice when something is not just. And the Bible states God is a just God. That's where that comes from.
And the interesting thing is saying that God is a just God. Well, what does just mean? That means fair. And
it's discerning, though.
It's discerning. Yes, that's where I was going.
Specific fairness.
That's what I was going to.
Was discerning fairness.
Was discernment.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry to jump ahead of you.
No, that's fine. So all the people who scream about all these things that are not fair, they're not just. What lens are you looking at it through? Fair compared to what? Just compared to what? To me, I always think that that's a good question to ask yourself on anything. If someone says that something is this or not this, okay, well, as compared to what? What lens are you looking through to give you that opinion? Because you were talking about how they've kind of unmoored themselves from the morality.
And they've co-opted this terminology in order to follow their own agenda. They've co-opted this stuff that is based on morality, but they have to separate it. It can't come from God because they're backwards. In their mind, like God and Christians and Catholics are evil.
Right.
How many wars have been fought in God's name? And, how many people have died because of religion? And look, there's truth in that. Like I said before, any good lie has a little truth in it.
Right.
And so they're picking out the parts that they want, which is kind of what I was trying to say earlier. Like, it's like a feminist, like, you can open the door for me and you can pay.
But I should make as much money as you.
I should make as much money as you, and you get to go down with the Titanic.
Yeah.
And I get to get on the boat.
Yeah. The utter hypocrisy and backwardness of their view. As I was thinking about this topic, I haven't read all of his work. I haven't even read a substantial amount of his work, but I got kind of wrapped up in the idea put forward by David Hume that you can't derive an ought from an is. And I was thinking about that and what that actually means.
That's a kind of a weird turn of phrase. Can you clarify that?
Sure. So substitute the word should for ought. Mm-hmm. What you should do or what you ought do.
Right.
From an is. So an is something apparent, right? Something is or is not.
Right.
Right.
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is. Yes.
I may have kind of like made a non sequitur from where we were at, but I think maybe I can close the loop on it. Let me see.
Okay.
So the idea behind that phrase is that you cannot make a determination of what should be or what you should do by simply looking at what is right in front of you. I think maybe this is kind of how my brain went there when you were talking about unmooring from the morality of something. Because what you ought to do or what you should do or what should be or what ought to be, the language in that is moral language. You know, if we both have agreed upon the idea that morality isn't necessarily a black and white, it understands the humanity of us and the inhumanity of us, the repercussions of the act are applied based upon that.
And it's still an overall value system based on right and wrong.
Correct. Right. I guess where I'm going with this is that how you were talking about feminism, I have this principle that as a woman, I should be treated equal as a man. Well, then shouldn't you pay for dinner? Should you open the door for the man? Should you sacrifice yourself to save him?
Should you fight just as hard to get more female bricklayers as you do female congresswomen and females in C-suites?
Right.
And females in prison, for that matter. Majority of people in prison are males.
Exactly.
You want to equalize that?
Yeah.
It's a bad Jordan Peterson impression.
No, I thought it was pretty good. This is maybe just the weird wiring in my brain, but that was kind of, I saw that as a connection point because the way that I see it in the phraseology, you can't derive an ought from an is. The word ought is a substitute for should, which is a question of morality. And is a stand-in for the idea of a principle.
Okay.
Which is actually kind of the opposite of what you were discussing earlier, where morals are a subset of principles. So if in your idea, morals are a subset of principles, how can we flesh out you can't derive an ought from an is?
So I don't know that I can flesh that out because I had not listened to that interview or read any of that material. I understand the premise. Maybe I would take it a different way. Ought from an is. So you can't derive what things should be from what it is that you're seeing. What is.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
When I think about that statement, and this may not be at all what his point was, but my mind goes to, what's the term that they use where they take someone's actions like 100 years ago and then they apply today's standards to them to judge them by? What's that? There's a term that they use. It's like nowism. It'll come to me. Anyway, you can't take today's standards. You can't take is. You can't derive ought from that.
What they should have done then.
At that time, what is, if they were to derive ought from it, then they wouldn't come up with the same thing that we come up with today. When we take today's standards and societal norms and then apply them to someone from 60 years ago, 100 years ago, or whatever, you know?
Mm-hmm.
That's where my mind goes when you make that statement. Tearing down statues of
Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, we're talking about tearing down statues of people. They might have been a stellar, outstanding, super principled, and moral person at that time in which they lived. They might have been the best person within 1,000 miles. Morals, right, wrong, justice, principled, all of the criteria that you would use to judge someone by. And then we want to apply today's is to what they ought to have done.
Yeah.
Right? That's a shift from the way that you interpreted what he was saying. Mm-hmm. I don't think I'm necessarily arguing with what you derive from it. I just derive something different from that.
Well, I think that's a good take,
you know,
and that's a good way to think about it. The way that I had thought about it was people have tried to dismiss this argument by, giving examples of like, well, it is raining outside, so you should take an umbrella, right? Well, I mean, that's not a moral action. Look, the way that I kind of interpret it was that you can't look at what is, which is the moment you're looking at it, it is a constant. Sure. You can't look at this constant. And in this case, we're talking about humanity. We're not talking about necessarily the physical world. Well, and I think your example of people in earlier times, it's hailing. Anybody, if you can hear that noise, sorry, we are recording and there is a storm passing right now. So if you hear clunk, 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 it's hail.
Yeah. For those of you in other parts of the world, welcome to Indiana.
Yeah. Don't like the weather? Just wait around for 5 minutes. It'll change.
Yeah.
But it kind of ties in. I think maybe the way you put it is the way that I'm thinking about it. You just articulated it better.
Okay.
Was that like, if you take a slave owner back in the 1700s,
Yeah.
right? That is the state of the world.
Doesn't mean that's what you should do.
It doesn't mean that that's what you should be doing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
You could apply the same thing today.
right. And you can't say that because that was the state of the world at that time,
That
you
makes
can't
it just.
You can't say that you should or should not own slaves, right? It's just that is the case.
Yes, the should or should not ought to come first. It ought not have anything to do with what is. It should stand on its own.
Right, but so does that change your mind then about the idea that we were talking about earlier where morals are a subset of principles?
No, because the should comes first. And the should is based in morals. So even in the founding documents, even with slavery, they said all men are created equal. They knew exactly what they were saying when they did that.
Yeah, I believe so. They knew that,
That was a rebuke of something that they knew was not right.
but they didn't
Even though
have-
that's what is at the time.
right.
They knew it ought not be,
Okay.
right? So I don't think that there's a conflict there. I don't.
Okay, then maybe the wording is just a little clunky because when I hear you say something is a subset of something else, that something else is a first requirement.
That's correct. It's clunky wording. So let me rephrase without putting any sort of hierarchy in. You can have principles without morals, but you can't have morals that aren't principled.
God agrees with you.
Either that or he's mad.
Or he's mad. He's like, dude, you got that totally wrong.
Dude.
Boom.
Freaking idiot. Why are you making this podcast anyway?
Freaking idiot. Dang.
Just make yourself a dang quesadilla.
Tina, come get your dinner.
Eats all the steaks. I bet I could throw a football over these mountains.
Dude, my absolute favorite scene in that, to this day, I die laughing when I see it, was when he grabs the steak and hits Napoleon when he's riding by on his bike.
Hey, watch this.
Just the way he throws it.
He doesn't even grab his own steak. He grabs Chips. And Chip's like, hey, I'm just really busy right now. I've been chatting online with hot babes all day.
Hot babes all day.
Now I'm training to be a cage fighter. Yeah, so sorry. You can have principles that are not moral. That's why I gave the example of the principle or the law of gravity. That has nothing to do with morals. That's just a principle that's universally understood. It's something
Okay.
that just exists. Doesn't matter where you are or where you're from.
Okay, but eliminate that. So,
Or I gave the example of there are times where it has nothing to do with right and wrong. It has nothing to do with morality. But I will make a decision and then I'll say to myself, it's the principle of the matter.
right, but
It
is
has
that
nothing to do with whether it's good or evil or anything. It's just like, I find there's a principle that I hold that's been violated. It doesn't mean that principle is biblically or morally based.
Okay.
It's just my own sense of justice.
okay, I got
Right.
you. Okay.
So principle is the reason why I said subset is because principle is wider. So there can be someone out there that's fighting for trans rights and they think that they're principled.
Okay, I understand
Right.
where you're coming from now.
They think they're principled, but if they had any recognition of the difference between what is and what ought to be, they would get their ought from a moral
Right. Okay.
standpoint.
I got you now.
Right?
Okay.
And if they did that, they would recognize that, oh, we're like chemically castrating children, and that's
Right.
pretty messed up. Actually, that's kind of evil.
Right.
But they don't have any moral. They might be principled in what they think they're fighting for, right?
Yep.
And
Okay.
that's why I keep saying there's always a little bit of truth in every lie.
Yeah.
Like I think that's a big lie. You know, that they're fighting for children.
But the small truth is we should support and protect children. They just think that
they think what that means
They
is
think that-
cutting their freaking junk off and
Yeah.
mutilating them and doing irreparable damage
right.
and having them make decisions.
Right. They can't make the decision to get a tattoo, but
They can't
can
drive,
and they can't
drink, they can't vote.
but they can change their sex. Okay, now that I am more clear on what you meant by
Does
that,
that- yeah.
yeah, that clears it up. Okay. Specifically addressing that point, because that was something that I was thinking about. That was probably the perfect example. So if you take the principled stance that a parent should have the right to determine the medical attention that child gets, that the parent always has final say on any medical interventions that a child has. That's the principle.
Yeah.
So when you apply that to, for instance, say, vaccination, you have people who would say that the school, the government,
Public health
administrations, they cannot override my parental authority on what happens medically to my child. And then here's the division line. Okay, well then you have a parent who wants to transition their child because they believe that medically that's necessary for their child. Well, then people like you and me would say, well, no, the state should then intervene and stop them because and this is the moral versus principled division.
Are you saying, how can you say that parents have the ultimate authority in one scenario but not in the other?
Right.
Is that the question?
Exactly.
That's okay.
Well, I'm not necessarily asking the question. I'm making the observation.
Okay.
Right. Again, I guess maybe this goes back to the idea that legally these things are derived in morality. The law is derived in morality because we would say from a moral standpoint that that's absolutely correct. The government cannot force a child to get a vaccination. The parent has the right to decide. You and I would both say that. But you and I would both also say, if we saw a parent who was transitioning their child, we would also say, no, we believe the government should intervene because we believe, based on our morals, that parent is harming the child.
Yes.
So the principled argument is that, and this is kind of where my mind is at when I say that the is or the principle is a black and white, right? It's one or the other. Because the principle is the parent has the final say in their child's medical needs.
Yep.
Right? That's the principle.
Yep.
But we would say, well, no, that can't always be true because there are instances where parents can do something medically that would harm their child.
Yeah, so I would counter that by saying there should be established parental rights. And I don't think that's something that is very well defined in today's society in America. Mm-hmm. There should be well-established parental rights. But with those rights come responsibilities. And I would counter that by saying, yes, you have the right to care for your child and to raise your child in the way that you feel is best for them. But if you are a child abuser, if you are abusing your child, you don't get to decide whether or not they go to the hospital. I'm not saying that is legally defined,
Right.
but it is somewhat defined because they're actually using those type of moral fundamental principles to go after parents that don't want to transition their kids in some states.
Right.
They're going after them saying that they are abusing their child by not confirming. And they're taking parental rights away, specifically in a split home, in a divorced family. So they are trying to take a moral stance, a moral high ground. But I would say parental rights need to be much better defined. And my counter would be, look, if you abuse your child, if you hurt your child, then those rights can be taken from you.
Yeah. And I didn't necessarily want to get down into the weeds on that specific issue. I wanted to use that issue because I think that it's a good way to recognize two different things. One, the difference between a principle and a moral. But the other thing is, as you were alluding to, it's a good way to recognize the flip side of a morality. It can actually be harder to hold a principle position as opposed to a moral position. I don't know. I still haven't figured that out. But what I can say is that when you're talking about human beings, I don't really think that you can lay down a principle and say that I will always abide by that principle. I just don't think you can do it because inevitably at some point that principle is going to butt heads with your morals. And what's more important, your principles or your morals? And I think maybe that's the question. What's more important, your principles or your morals? Right? Because like I said, to go back to the example, you can have the principle that a parent has the final say in their child's medical treatment. But for you and me, that butts heads with our morals when you see like a parent transitioning their child. And the reverse is opposite when we would say, I don't want my child to get the COVID vaccine as a requirement to go back to school, where you have all the people on the other side saying that you have to, and they want to mandate it. And they essentially did, or they tried to, saying that, the kids can't come back to school unless they're vaccinated. This is just a really easy way to see the distinction between a principled stand and a moral stand.
I can easily take a principled stand, and more often than not, that principled stand is going to be rooted in morality. I think where the area that you're talking about, that you're struggling with, is that there are plenty of people that take a principled stand without the compass of morality. Right? And sometimes it's a denial of the compass. That compass exists, like we've already talked about. That compass exists because of the inherent morality and the value system that's ingrained in the culture, in the society, right? I'm not meaning to get into the weeds on trans stuff and and vaccines.
I'm
and
not
all that
either.
Kind of stuff. But you can't throw your child down a staircase and then say, no, they're not going to the hospital. You've lost the ability to make that judgment for them because it's obvious that your intentions are not what's best for them, right?
Right. And so then the interesting part is, as a function of social conditioning, obviously pushing your kid down the stairs is an obvious example.
It's dramatic. I'm just trying to make the point.
No, and
these people are abusing children.
I understand. I understand. So where I'm trying to go with this, in an obvious example, yes, right? But in the event of social conditioning where you legitimately have someone who thinks that this is not abuse, but that it's care, this is the interesting part of the conversation. And I think this ties in very well to back what you were saying earlier about how they have principles that are unmoored from morality. Is that how you said it? Or
Yeah.
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 And I think that this is the thread between the two. What's more important, your principles or your morals? Right? I knew eventually we could close the circle, right?
Yeah, sure.
I don't know. It only took us 20 minutes, but we got there, right? Right?
Yeah.
But that's the thread right there. And the thing that's swirling around in my head is, what do you do when you're in a culture and a society that has been held hostage by immoral principles?
Immoral people co-opting concepts from moral principles in which they disagree with the fundamental origins of those principles.
Yeah. That's an interesting way to phrase it. Because the way that you phrase it shows you directly what the issue is.
They're like 3 steps removed from reality,
Yeah.
where it all comes from, what it all means. They're just making shit up. They're trying to take a grain of truth to mask the lie. I don't know. Is that too harsh?
No.
Yeah,
But my question is, what do you do when you have a society with a lot of people who truly believe that their immoral position is in fact a moral position?
You stand, you speak, you raise your family appropriately. You stand in the gap when you can. That's all you can do. And what is going on right now with the transing of the kids is barbaric. What's going on right now with the mass abortion statistics is barbaric. History will flesh that out.
I agree.
Because right and wrong still exist. It doesn't change.
Mm-hmm.
There are some principles that exist without morals. Honestly, pull a number out. 80% of the time, principles are founded in morals. And morals are defining what is right and wrong.
60% of the time, it works every time.
Right. So I don't know statistically, but we're not talking statistic. We're talking like philosophic. And I think the majority of principles are founded in some roots of morality. And we've already defined morality as one of the key components of morality is understanding between right and wrong. Mm-hmm. Or what do they say? Goodness and badness.
Well, the goodness or badness of human behavior.
It's good versus evil.
Yes.
We are just living in an evolved physical world and a devolved spiritual world.
That I agree with. So this is where I have landed on this, is that you can determine that we are in that space where people are trying to go by the letter of the law as opposed to the spirit of the law.
Sure, yeah.
Because if you're not going by the spirit of the law, the intention behind it, the thought of what is right and wrong, if you're not guided by that, then you're not being guided by a righteous moral ethic. You know, everything going on today, you know, you've got the whole deportation situation, you've got the birthright citizenship thing going to the Supreme Court. I mean, all of the lawfare that you see, like what you're seeing is that the leftists, they're trying to go by the letter of the law. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The comma or the semicolon changes the definition.
Kind of like the only garbage I see is his supporters. Oh, I didn't mean his supporters.
Just as a quick example, like the birthright citizenship thing, it was opening arguments or whatever they do in the Supreme Court, just happened today with this. Now, me being just a regular old dude. When I read the 14th Amendment with a moral compass,
What are they trying to say here?
The way that I read it is, in understanding the time that it was written, it was meant to apply to the children and offspring of slaves.
Absolutely.
I'll just read this here real quick. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside.
So they have a clarifying statement. They didn't say all persons born in the United States are citizens. There are clarifying statements inside of that section 1.
The way that I read it, the person is subject to the jurisdiction thereof, means that you are subject to the laws and to the protections of that place. I mean, this kind of gets into constitutional weeds, but the Constitution is written for the American people. But if you're an immigrant and you have a child, are you not subject to the jurisdiction of your home country? I would argue that yes, you are.
You are a citizen of that country.
You're a citizen of that country, so you're subject to their jurisdiction.
So getting back to where you started on this is the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. If the spirit of the law was all persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside, then why do they have the stipulations or naturalized and subject to the jurisdiction thereof?
Yeah.
The spirit of the law is clear based on the time frame. This was intentionally written to make sure that slaves that were involuntarily brought here, their children would be citizens of the United States.
Yeah. And if you look at the 13th Amendment is the abolition of slavery. And that was in 1865. And so, again, if you go with the spirit and understanding of the time, they had just passed an amendment abolishing slavery. The slaves weren't considered citizens, and they didn't have any of the rights that citizens had. And they're like, all right, we freed all these slaves, but they all had kids and they all have families. Do they get treated as non-citizens? Well, no, they shouldn't. Their families have been treated horribly. If we're abolishing slavery, then all of these children who have been born here to these slaves should have the right of citizenship.
And we're going to define
and
that.
we're going to give it to them.
Yes,
we're going to define it
that
and give it to them.
Yes.
So that's the spirit of it.
Yeah.
The spirit of it was to right a wrong.
Yeah, you got the 13th and the 14th.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I think the way that I see everything playing out right now is you can see the sides, right? Who is working on a moral ground and who is working on a maybe principled ground, but definitely not a moral one.
Right. Which goes back to the spirit of the law and the letter of the law.
Right, exactly.
Like you were saying. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. They're trying to twist the letter of the law, even though the spirit of the law was made to right a wrong for people that were brought here against their will. That's why the law was written. And they're trying to apply it to people that actually break other laws.
Right.
And voluntarily do so to get here.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's an interesting kind of take on that.
Yeah, that was something that popped into my head as that seems to me like that's the current iteration of a principled versus a moral stand. The spirit of the law is the moral underpinnings of it.
Yeah, and so now we're getting into this area that there's a lot of stuff going on that front. You have a lot of people trying to interpret things their own way. I mean, you have district judges that are somehow able to strike down national.
Yeah,
they're
universal injunctions.
Yeah, they're able to make national decisions, and honestly, they don't have the authority to do that. Well,
No.
I mean, the Supreme Court's going to decide that, but
yeah,
And that's going on right now too.
Right.
So they're going to figure that out. And I hope that comes down the right way, because I guess that's a two-sided coin.
It is.
You know,
it is,
I mean, our only way to fight back against Biden was some judges being like, you can't do this, man.
Well, I think
it's a tough one.
I think there's a time and a place, right? I think the idea behind what Trump is doing with the executive orders, I think he's doing it knowing it's going to get challenged.
It's got to get pushed.
And it will get pushed to the Supreme Court.
They got to make
to
a
where
decision.
they make a decision.
Yeah.
Right or wrong what their decision is, whatever way they rule, at least there's a decision on it.
I do think I think it's nuanced though, because
I think it is.
Because mandates that Biden got struck down, they were unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what should happen right now, local jurisdictions or district judges should not be able to mandate anything for the entire country.
Right.
Right?
I would agree.
They should not be able to make an injunction that affects federally the entire United States of America. And if they feel that it's constitutionally sound, they should appeal, and it should be elevated to a federal level. It should go to the Supreme Court. And then they can make that decision.
Maybe
not that I entirely trust the system. We got Ketanji Brown Jackson, who doesn't know what a woman is.
Yeah, even though she believes in a woman's right to vote.
And
right. So, I mean, if you don't know what a woman is, then let's abolish which amendment is that?
And the strong Hispanic woman, Sonia Sotomayor. Yeah. I'm no lawyer. I'm just calling it how I see it, right?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and just to put a bow on it, and this will tie it back to the morality versus the principle versus an immorality or unprincipled view. I just saw a post on X the other day. I can't remember if he was I think he was talking about either birthright citizenship or some legal issue that was going on right now where Trump had ignored, I think it was the deportation maybe of Abrego Garcia, may have been, right? And this super liberal guy, one of the Krasensteins, I don't know if you know who they are, but he had put a post on X that said, basically deriding Trump that he doesn't believe in the rule of law because he's clearly defying a court order. And just to troll the guy, just to troll him, I put a comment. He never, I've trolled him a couple times, but he never answers me back. But I get interaction from other people. It's fun. But then I commented on it. I said, so in a completely non-aggressive way, it's so then what's your stance on when Biden ignored a judicial ruling saying that he couldn't forgive student loan debt and did it anyway? And so this ties it back to the morality versus the principle of it, and how some people they're not even operating on a principled or a moral standard.
They have nothing to stand on.
They have nothing to stand on, and either they don't see it or they don't care. And what is that person? Either a sociopath or a psychopath. And so this is the only thing that I can conclude about people like him, is that he's either a sociopath or a psychopath. A sociopath would say, I don't care about what's right and wrong. I just want the interaction. I just want fame. I just want the money that's coming from all of this, right? That would be a sociopath. So I would just have to assume that somebody like him is a sociopath, right?
Yeah, because there's no principle there. You can't say that and then not say anything about Biden ignoring the immigration laws.
Right.
And letting 12 to 20 million people in the country unvetted.
It's typical. There's no response. I got one person that tried to troll me back, and his only thing that he said was, that's not a relevant question, or that's an unrelated question. And I responded, I'm like, no, I'm just genuinely trying to understand his position. It's like, what's your position? Either you're for obeying the court orders or you're not.
Yeah.
And it's just like, no. So I don't know. Where have we ended up?
In my opinion, and it seems like you're kind of there too, is that in reality, many of our principles are based on morality, or they come from moral principles. There are principles that are outside of that. Those are normally pretty vanilla. It's not a question of right or wrong, good and evil, ethics, anything like that. It's just like law of gravity, principles of aerodynamics, things that just are, right? Universal truths. And we have, in my opinion, one side that's searching for truth and trying to remain consistent. So I'm glad that you brought up the whole vaccine versus trans and the kids thing, because it is difficult to maintain consistency when there are those rare circumstances where your moral stance and your principled stance can provide a certain amount of conflict. I don't see them as completely conflicting. I think one overrides the other. But depending on who you are.
And that was what I was trying to get to.
It depends on who you are.
Depends on who you are.
Because of who I am, my moral principles always override any other principles that I have. I can still maintain both of those things. I don't know how the left freaking shoehorns these squares into these circles.
It's bewildering.
I don't know how they do it, but so they completely detach themselves from any moral value. And yet, what's the thing that they're yelling about all the time is justice.
And they're
justice for this, justice for that.
And their whole shtick is we have the moral high ground. Like that's always been kind of their.
Sometimes you got to throw a punch for the children.
For the children.
I mean, they're so twisted.
Yeah.
They have co-opted good things. They've co-opted good things, and in my opinion, twisted them to try and serve their sociopathic purposes for evil. So you can say these like universal truths and then stand behind them. Like, we need to protect children, and that includes trans children. Look, I'm against trans children, but I'm not out there like beating up trans kids or, or being a fucking, even being mean to them or saying anything to them, you know?
Yeah.
I'm not going out there. I'm just calling on parents to like find it in your heart to love your child enough to question the orthodoxy that is and think about what ought.
Yes.
Right?
There you go. There you go.
You know?
And I think with that whole ought and is thing, and that's where I was trying to get to.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Try to come to a reasonable ought and not necessarily base it on what is.
Yeah, and people know. People know, Isaiah, even if they're not founded in Christianity and they don't have a relationship with God, or if they have a different religion, people fundamentally know.
I think so.
Unless you're a sociopath, then you just don't care. The only thing you care about is not getting caught.
Right.
Being a sociopath.
Yeah. and honestly,
take those people out of the equation, people know. You know what's right and wrong.
And I agree, but I think that the problem is where we've arrived at today. We are allowing and we've subsidized sociopathic behavior.
We reward it.
Reward, subsidize, I'm kind of, but...
It's every C-suite in every major corporation in America. They're all sociopaths.
Yeah.
There's no way you can make those decisions that affect so many people and not have any empathy.
Yeah. I think that unfortunately we're in a moment right now where we have allowed the proliferation of sociopathic tendencies.
The dark tetrad. Isn't that what Peterson talks about? Machiavellian and dark tetrad.
Oh, it's Machiavellian. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you...
And that's a dangerous thing.
Yeah. It's not good. It's seriously not good.
Seriously not good. Seriously not good. But I think that we've gotten to a place where those with sociopathic tendencies, we've allowed it to kind of burrow in, and we've gotten to, unfortunately, to a stage where those people have now become elevated somehow in our culture. And I think that this goes to my whole entire worldview, that currently right now what you're seeing is a battle between good and evil. And the reason that the tension is so prevalent right now is because the sociopaths have figured out that we have figured them out. And one of the issues is that the liberals, God bless them, in the 1950s and 60s, and, they were trying to do good, but they have lost the moral high ground. They don't have it anymore. And because of their empathetic nature, that is where the sociopaths have burrowed into and taken over. And the more conservative leaning people, having, generally speaking, a moral foundation because they're generally more religious than the liberals, they have more of a moral compass. And for them, us, it's easier to see the sociopath than it is for the liberal. And like I said, I think that the reason the tension is there, the tension will always be there between a battle between good and evil. But the problem is exacerbated when the sociopath knows that we know he's there.
Yes, because deception is a key to them maintaining control, manipulation, power, whatever it is that they're after. And when you pull back the curtain on that, that is a huge threat.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're at.
Yeah, I'll buy that. I'll buy that.
Cool. Well, I said one cool thing during the episode, so.
It's conversation, man. It's conversation.
All right. I think that was a good one.
Most of this was off the cuff. We just kind of had a idea to start going with, and sorry we went down some rabbit holes, but
and sorry I am inarticulate, generally speaking, but
I think most of it was relevant to the topic, even if it took us a minute to complete the circle.
Yeah, and I think, like you said earlier, this is actually the foundation of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah.
Is have the discussion about truth. At the end of the day, the truth is the foundation of everything.
Yeah, it's the roots.
And if you don't know what the truth is, then you've built your house on sand.
Or you just say it's my truth and you just make shit up.
Right. But you're still building your house on sand because you are a temporary being in this eternal.
And then you dye your hair blue and then someone videotapes you screaming at the clouds.
Yeah. No! So
for the children.
That was so creepy. That is maybe one of the creepiest clips I've ever seen of her. For the children.
Yeah.
It's so creepy.
So a sociopath says what?
When you're in the arena, you got to be ready to take a punch. You got to be ready to throw a punch for the children.
So yeah, this is what we want. We want to inspire you all to be having these conversations. If you're not comfortable having these conversations with anyone you know, at least think about it yourself. I could think about this for weeks and weeks and still maybe not come to any full-blown conclusions. Some of it gets muddy. It gets difficult. It can be difficult to understand where your position is. But at the end of the day, the more you think about these things, at least you have reasoning behind why you are where you are. And it gives you the shield to defend yourself. That's all any of us can do. So think about it. And if you can, have the conversation with friends, family, whoever. Hit us up in the comments on Rumble. Let us know what you think. I'm sure that there's many of you out there who have thought plenty of brilliant things that I haven't thought of or that Andy hasn't thought of.
I'll say one more thing before we let you guys go. You know, if you're one of the people out there that you're a good person, you know you're a good person, but you're not a religious person, don't really believe in God, just kind of find all of that a little hokey or just can't draw a line. You know, you're on the fence. I would just encourage you to think about it. What are the things that you do that make you a good person? What are the ways that you act? What empathies do you have? What stances do you take? What is it that makes you a good person? I would just encourage you to think about, where do those things really come from? Where do they come from?
And think deeper than my parents.
Because if you open your mind to it, and just be honest with yourself, where do those things come from? Did you just come up with that? Are you just doing stuff so that you don't get arrested? Or do you really know what's right and wrong, regardless of whether or not you're going to get arrested for it?
Right.
Nobody's mandating morality. You know what's right and wrong. Where does that come from?
Good question. And with that, we'll let you guys stew on it, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks for listening. Hope it inspires some
vigorous thinking.
Some vigorous thinking and some internal soul searching. So thanks, guys. We'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, y'all.